totally. That way he can see some smiling, nodding faces. So we're going to ask those of you who are panelists to unmute your camera, mute your microphone, but turn on your camera. That way we can take advantage of having Walt being able to see sort of an audience watching him as he presents this session. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Robin.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. I am excited today to get to introduce Dr. Walt Lee from Virginia Tech. He is an associate professor in the Department of Engineering Education Research, and he is the director of the Center for Enhancement of Engineering Diversity. He focuses on research and he focuses on research to practice cycle in his research, and his career goal, which I made a note of because I think that this should be all of our career goals, is to be a driving force in national efforts to diversify engineering and make sure anyone, regardless of background, can be successful in an engineering program. And now I'll turn it over.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I appreciate so many people being here. This is probably one of the bigger crowds I have presented in front of in a while. So, and I know you could be doing anything else, but you've decided to join us for an hour and talk about broad participation. So the title of my talk is The Uphill Battle of Broad Participation. Why I consider an uphill battle will make more sense as I move forward. But at a high level, I'm gonna be talking about a project focused on broadening participation. As a note, I can see the chat and the questions. So if you type something that is real urgent, you will probably get my attention, and I don't mind stopping if there's a question that needs to be answered sooner rather than later. Provide a little more context about who I am. So as was mentioned, I am an associate professor of engineering education at Virginia Tech, where I also work as the director for research with the Center for the Enhancement of Engineering Diversity, which basically means I attend meetings and provide expertise as it relates to assessment, research, and seeing where I can lend my knowledge of the research to help the university. My background is in industrial systems engineering, so that has definitely influenced the way I approach my engineering education research. And I have a general interest in all things related to diversity. So if you can name it and it's related to the ways in which we're different, it kind of piques my interest, and that'll also probably make more sense as I move forward. But that is kind of the lens in which I view a lot of this work. It's from a fundamental interest in how we deal with the fact that we all are different, and that shows up in a lot of different ways. So based on this interest, I run a research group called GUIDE, or Growing in Our Understanding of Inclusive Diversity in Engineering, where we're really trying to grapple with being more strategic and intentional about how we address those differences and the different ways they shows up, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, class, like any way in which society is socially stratified is kind of interest, and we explore this in a couple of different ways. I like to orient people to my interests with 4 questions. I use these questions to decide whether or not something is in line with the focus of my group, but also to explain to people why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I use each of these questions, like everything I do, I try to make sure it fits with one of these questions. So the first question is, how do we better support students with diverse backgrounds? The second question is, how do we make engineering more equitable, accessible, and inclusive? The third question is, how might we broaden participation? And the fourth question is, how might we educate students and faculty about diversity? So as you can imagine, these are very big questions, and I'll probably spend the rest of my career trying to answer them, but this provides you with some scope of the boundary, where if you ask a question that is within bounds of one of these 4 questions, I will probably have an opinion. Once you start getting a little further outside of these 4 questions, you're probably leaving my circle of competence, and I may or may not have an opinion or a question. Today, I'm going to specifically talk about the question of how might we broaden participation, because I, along with some colleagues, have spent the last 3 or 4 years really thinking about this from an intentional way as it relates to the research to practice cycle. So the objective for this is, at the end of this hour, I'm hoping that you will have a better understanding of the complex nature of actually broadening participation. So understanding what realizing impact might actually take and look like. And then also thinking more critically about the research to practice cycle. So we have kind of this general idea of what that cycle looks like, and it influences the way we position ourselves as researchers and practitioners and in relation to one another. And I'm hoping that you can think a little more critically about what that actually looks like so that it can inform your future work. Before I start, what does it mean to broaden participation? So like when I say we're going to talk about broadening participation, what do you assume I'm going to talk about? If you could type in the chat, that would be great. Like, what comes to mind? including a wider range of backgrounds, diverse classes, more equitable representation across any stratification, diversity who we include, who can participate, allowing people to be present and engage, recruitment and support, encouraging people, making people feel welcome, making sure that everyone is not only white men, enabling diverse students, wider swath, diversifying the workforce, non-traditional students, demographics to reflecting society. So as you can see from the answers, even though we as a field use this phrase, broad participation, we're not all talking about the exact same thing, which is important because if we're moving towards this goal and we're trying to do this thing that we call broad participation, if we're not on the same page, that has a lot of implications for how we move forward. But I like to start off by getting that out on the table because it can be helpful to kind of just say, this is what I'm talking about, because as I just showed, everyone is not thinking about the exact same thing. So I'd like to start with this definition from the National Science Foundation, where they really anchor on approving engineering interest, preparation, connections, experiences, and opportunities. So a lot of these connect to a lot of the stuff that was mentioned in the chat, but for the time being, I want you to hold this as a functional definition for what we mean by broadening participation. So now I have another question. How are we doing? You can answer using a smiley face, or you can type with words. I have one frown, a lot of frowns. Making some progress. Okay, so there is some positivity. Fairly frown, terrible, getting worse. We have a nah, not great. So there's a little more consistency here where most people would say we are not doing great. At least one person acknowledges that we are making some progress, and some people think we're doing terrible and it's getting worse. I also like to start here too, because in addition to us having varied ways of defining what it is, we also have varied ways of deciding if we're even making progress. So I see good progress in research, but not so much in practice and implementation. So another reason I like to start this way is because I think that it really depends on what it is you're using. So for example, I could show you a number that could justify any response you possibly gave me. So if I wanted to say we're doing bad or even getting worse, I could show you the proportion of bachelor degrees awarded to Black or African Americans across around the last decade and make the argument that it is getting worse. We were at 4.6 at one point and it's gone down. Like, this is not what the goal is. Or I could focus on the pure numbers and say, we've actually almost doubled some of the numbers. So like if I wanted to, I could make an argument that we're not actually doing as bad as that number would lead you to believe. And there are more Black people. There are just a lot more other people. As you can see from 2009 to 2018, there are a lot more engineers, which of course means there are also a lot more people that identify as Black or African American. And if I wanted to make the case that we actually are not doing that bad, I could use this metric called engineering yield, which is from 2005 where the data was collected, but I'd be very surprised if it changed drastically. This researcher basically made the argument that it's unfair to compare engineering's representation to the entire population because the field of engineering is only recruiting from students who are going to college. So they normalized for the amount of people who are earning degrees and then looked at where engineering fell. And as you can see, the differences are not as drastic once you account for the fact that there's differences. So if you wanted to make this argument, you could also say, we're not doing terrible. And you might even be saying like, we're actually doing about what we should expect based on the quality of the K-12 education. So I personally do not think we're doing great. Depending on what day of the week you ask me, will depend on whether I think we're doing terrible or just doing okay as a field. But the fact that we are not doing great and everyone can't say, yes, we are where we need to be, is like the central motivation behind the project and the work that I'm going to talk about today. More specifically, the goal of the project that I'm going to talk about was to really investigate the research to practice cycle as it relates to broad participation. So me and some of my colleagues, who I will mention very shortly, are seeing the numbers and took that to mean that either one, we are trying to solve the problem incorrectly, or we're just going about trying to solve it in a way that actually does not represent what we're doing. Like, there has to be something wrong. So if you're not familiar, this is a picture of the innovation cycle of education, research, and practice that is, I wouldn't say used by everyone in the field, but it has become like a common representation of the relationship between research and practice. So in theory, education practice should identify and motivate our questions, which should lead to education research, which will give answers and insights that will improve practice. And as you keep going through this cycle, if this is how it actually works, we should get more broadened participation. Like if this is the reality, then if you take a step back, this should be what it shows. But as you can imagine, there's some things not happening. So this project is really looking to see like, where is this breaking down? Either it is breaking down or it's not actually working this way, and we wanted to unpack this. So the project I'm going to talk about is called Pushing Students Away, Developing a Research Agenda for Broadening Participation of African Americans in Engineering and Computer Science. And I've been working on this project with Dr. Jeremy London, Dr. Beverly Watford, Dr. Shanae Hawkins-Ash, Tiara Holloman, and Crystal P, and some other people. This is the stable part of the group that has been working on it the most part. There are some other people that have been involved in the project in some smaller components. So while today I will be representing my own perspective, the work that I'm moving forward with is not a reflection of my own. And I also do want to note that this work is supported by National Science Foundation, and that anything I say is my own work, and this might not necessarily reflect what NSF thinks. And I see the comment from James about the fact that they're more quantitative. So we are going to revisit this. I want you to hold that thought, but that is definitely a valid point. So the project that we had, so this is what we proposed in the proposal. So we said we were going to start off by doing a systematic lit review. Then we were going to interview experts. Then in the third phase, we were going to do a Delphi working group. And then at the end, we would have an advanced understanding of this problem and promote a research agenda. If you are familiar with NSF projects, things do not always happen the exact way you proposed it. But the initial idea was we wanted to make sure we were not reinventing the wheel and understood what we already knew in the literature. But then we also wanted to acknowledge the fact that there are experts who are doing the work who have knowledge that is not documented in some of the more traditional journal articles and conference papers. And then in the third phase, unlike some, there are a lot of efforts where people will bring experts in the room together to decide what the steps moving forward should be. And we wanted to do something similar to that, but we wanted it to be grounded in the literature and lived experiences. And we also didn't want who was making the suggestion to influence people. So we were proposing doing a Delphi study so we could get the expertise without necessarily that influence. And that ultimately would lead us to a research agenda. So we ended up staying kind of close. So we started off with a mapping review. If you aren't familiar, a mapping review is basically similar to a systematic lit review. Instead of reading the actual articles, you're more so looking at things at the abstract level and trying to get a high level like map of the literature land. We started there because, as you could imagine, trying to do a systematic lit review on a title, on the topics such as African Americans in engineering, is a very broad title and you'd have to make some decisions. So the mapping review helped us do that. We also did interviews with experts. So we did 40 interviews with subject matter experts. And then we are currently in the middle of doing a Delphi study to figure out what we should do moving forward. Today, I'm going to largely be anchoring on insights from these subject matter experts, but I will note that because we've done all these other things, it's real hard to disentangle what you know from the interviews versus what you have also learned from going through the systematic reviews and mapping review. For sampling, so to understand who it is we interviewed, we used a combination of purposeful sampling and theoretical sampling. So before we started, we looked at who the authors were, who we knew had expertise, and also took nominations to think about who we really needed to talk to. But then also, as we were interviewing people, we used theoretical sampling to identify gaps. Whenever, for example, if we realized we didn't have anybody who had experience in the K-12 system from like an educator standpoint, we would then go seek out somebody who could bring that perspective, because we did want to get to the point that we thought as much as the problem and landscape of us trying to solve the problem could be understood and represented in the perspectives. During the conversations, we asked them a broad range of questions. So one of the questions we asked them was how they personally measured progress. So to James' point, to get a good idea of like, are they using quantitative metrics, qualitative metrics, like what does that actually look like? Why do they think we're not making progress nationally? What have they seen that they thought have been effective? Where they have seen education research contribute to solving the problem, and like, what does that look like? And then also where they think the cycle breaks down, if anywhere. So this is a high level general understanding of what we had, what the conversations were about, to really get a better understanding of what the landscape looks like as it relates to the research and practice communities trying to solve this problem. To code the interviews, we used a combination of descriptive coding, value coding, process coding, and evaluation coding. And again, these maps with the questions. So we used descriptive coding to understand what they thought the problem was and what measures they were using to monitor progress. For stakeholders, we used value coding to figure out what value, attitudes, and beliefs they had about the variety of people involved in this problem. We used process coding to get a good understanding of how they saw research and practice connecting in a process from a process lens. And then we used evaluation coding to get their general judgments about how things were going, as well as some of the things we were trying to do. So now I want to talk about some preliminary insights. Before I proceed, if you are a pure qualitative researcher and you are expecting me to show you a bunch of rich, thick descriptions and quotes, I'm gonna just let you know right now that is not what's about to happen, because that's just not the way I present research a lot of times. So I'm gonna put that out. So if that is a critique, I'm fully aware of the decision that I have made. And also that because this is preliminary, any and all feedback you have is very helpful, because we're in the process of trying to turn this into a manuscript. So if there are things we're overlooking, or if something's not clear, or if you have any suggestions of things to read, all of that is very welcome. So what I'm going to talk about next are some insights that are driving what we're basically trying to reimagine what the research and practice cycle looks like. And it might be like our attempt at trying to create like an innovation cycle of broadening participation in engineering, practice, and research, specifically for African Americans. So I'm going to kind of talk through some of the things I've learned, and also show you what I think that means for the way we conceptualize the relationship between research and practice. While the examples I'm going to give are specifically about the participation of Black Americans in engineering and computer science, if you study some other topics, you might see some things that are very transferable, because I think a lot of these results are not necessarily that unique to the context that we're talking about. So as a reminder, this is where we started off. So just have this image in your head. And we didn't throw the whole thing out. So we do think that practice and research being there, and there being some questions and insights, like that part we have kept as the core. And I'm going to build on this image as I move forward. So the first insight is that the research to practice cycle has to be contextualized. And the way I'll position it to you is the difference between like the solution space, or where our solutions are, but also the problem space. And I think currently when you look at the research to practice cycle, while it represents one potential solution space, it does not provide anything in relation to the problem space, which kind of removes some of the context that you actually need to understand moving forward. So for this problem, two of the real big problems that come up are, you have to situate your research in the context of systemic racism and resource disparities in the United States that are often along the lines of race. So those are, if you're going to do this work, those are two very central problems that you just can't get rid of, because they're underlying issues to why we're seeing what we're seeing. There are two more issues. The other two are, you also have to understand the way the US education system is structured, as well as the relationship between the public and engineering in the United States, because both of those also have a very significant influence on who's participating in engineering. So as you can imagine, when you're taking a step back and you're looking at a problem that is situated in the context of, we're dealing with racism at a systemic level, there are resource disparities that are along those lines. We have an education system that also allocates resources and instruction in a very way. And then we also have a US engineering system where people engage with and have interest and awareness of it in a certain way. You can create like the perfect storm to make it very hard to solve this problem. And as you can imagine, these are things that are hard to see. So if I would ask you what you think the underlying problem is, some of you might say racism or anti-Blackness or resource disparities, or use one of these very high level concepts. But a lot of you would probably more so point to things that are symptoms of these, but do not actually get at the underlying issue. So these are four of the symptoms that people are most likely to recognize, but they can't be disentangled from the ones above. So for example, people notice resource allocations. So they are very aware of the fact that certain schools have more money than others, or certain people can't afford to go to school. Like the fact that that money is not spread out evenly in this country, and resources not spread out evenly, people can like visually see that, and they can wrap their head around that. The second thing people also notice is interpersonal racism. So we're very familiar with the fact that some people have interpersonal interactions that are very negative, and that can impact people. There are negative perceptions of the Black people in these spaces, as well as there are some negative perceptions about engineering as a whole as from relates to the public. And then lastly, from a more environmental standpoint, people often will talk about the fact that there are chilly climates and things of that nature. So the reason I differentiate between the actual issues and the symptoms is, as you can imagine, like if you really just said, oh, we're just going to get rid of the negative perceptions, that does not solve any of the things up top. But also, if you only acknowledge the root causes but not the symptoms, it's real hard to tell people how to recognize systemic racism, and you can't disentangle. So it's not that it's just racism. It's not that it's just resource disparities. It's the fact that all of these things are happening at the same time, and they're basically creating the perfect storm that makes it very hard for Black people to pursue these degrees and to have positive experiences as we move forward. So if with that insight, if you come back, so now we have this relationship between practice and research, and we would argue that you need to situate this in the problem space, and that whenever you're doing this work, if you ignore the context, you're basically getting off on the wrong foot from the very beginning, and you're likely trying to solve a problem that's not actually a problem. The second insight is the fact that non-BPE research and BPE assessment are both relevant. So if you recall from the initial research or practice cycle, we have this nice, neat cycle that assumes that there's practice and research that are in a very interdependent cycle, and that practice is getting its insights from that research, and that research is being informed by that cycle. When you talk to people, you realize that practitioners are not only relying on the work that's done in the field like engineering education, and they're pulling in insights from research and knowledge all over the place. It does not have to necessarily even be about broad participation engineering, but they're also informing their insights based on assessment, which we don't necessarily pull into the ways in which we think about improving this problem. This becomes real apparent when you start thinking about, for example, this project. So as a reminder, our project was focused on broad participation, African Americans, and engineering and computer science. So as I mentioned, because we started off with a mapping review and we wanted to look at the literature, a central question we had to ask is this information relevant? So as you can imagine, if 10 researchers were tasked with doing this, all of us might have took very different approaches as it relates to deciding what information we would consider relevant to this problem and what information we would consider out of bounds. So for example, if I put a stack of papers down and was like, these papers are about higher education, these ones are about STEM education, these ones are about engineering and computer science education, these ones are specifically about African Americans in education, I could create another stack that says these ones are about Black people in the United States. And like every time I created a different stack, you would have to make a call. Is this closely enough? Is this related enough to the topic to be included, or am I going to discard this information? And as a practitioner, you have to make a very similar call. Whenever you come across a paper or when you come across some information, you do have to make a decision like, is this fair game or is this not fair game? Oh, let me go back. For our project in the mapping review, we decided to use a series of 3 questions to make a decision. So this is to make it real transparent that we could have made a different decision. One, we started off by saying like, is the article about education or the STEM workforce? So if it was not about one of those 2 things, we wanted to note that. If it was, we also wanted to note, is the context engineering, computer science, or STEM? We decided to go with STEM because if we would have just said engineering and computer science, we realized that there's a lot of work in the K-12 space that we would have unintentionally just completely disregarded as being not relevant. And then the third question we asked was, are African Americans in the population, or is broadening participation as a phenomenon the focus? And as we went through, we made the decision that if something was all 3 of those, we would include it. If it was only one of those, we would not include it. And if it was at least 2 of these, we would have a second opinion. So as you can imagine, as I mentioned, we could have added multiple additional questions. But we basically had to make a lot of subjective judgment before we could even decide what we know by just putting boundaries about whose knowledge we consider legitimate as we move forward. And this is what we did. So this is from a paper that was recently published that was us deciding kind of what does it look like we've been doing more closely related. So at least in the STEM context, and the participants had to either specifically be in our population or the topic had to be close enough that it was real clear that they had the problem in mind. So what this looks like is now if you have this relationship between broad and engineering education, practice, and research situated in the problem context, is you have to acknowledge that there's research that is coming from outside the problem context that you need to account for, and there's assessment going on that is also providing answers and insights. This is real important consideration because I think a lot of times us as discipline situated researchers, we reinvent the wheel sometime when realistically someone already could have told you that was true. If we would have realized that you can go get that non-BPE research and start from that point instead of necessarily thinking that we have to come up with all the insights before it's relevant. The third insight is that people cannot always be classified as researchers and practitioners. So in the initial model, we have research and practice in these very distinct boxes. And as you can imagine, if I asked most of you if you are a researcher or a practitioner, and if I was talking about the area you're in, it might be real hard for you to say, I am always a researcher or I am always a practitioner. And what you see is most people, a lot of people fit in this middle ground, and it gets interesting as it relates to the way we view the flow of information when we realize that like the people themselves do not stay in these nice clean spots as we move forward. What further complicates it when you're talking about broadening participation of a specific group is not only are the people not clearly researchers or practitioners, they're not even always engineers, or it's hard to explain. So basically, we were talking to people who were not just engineers, and people who just were not just Black, and people who were not always just Black engineers. They were people who operated in both spaces. So because they were, almost all of them were Black and almost all of them were engineers, when you're having this conversation, the priorities of the two spaces shift. So for example, you can imagine if I talk to a group of engineers about the relationship between engineering and Black people, I will get a very different conversation than if I talk to a group of Black people about the relationship between engineering and Black people. And I would get an even more different conversation if I talked to a group of Black engineers about the relationship. So the positionality of the researchers, or the positionality of the subject matter experts, matters a whole lot. And I think this is one of the reasons you don't see people solely as researchers or practitioners, because a lot of the people who do this work are not only doing it for intellectual reasons, they're often doing it because they've lived the experience and they're very committed to the communities, whether the students are in engineering or not. And you see that kind of play out. One example would be if you talk to people about what progress looks like. If you're only talking to engineers, they might say students graduating with engineering degrees is what progress looks like. When you're talking to people who are prioritizing the interests of the Black community, if the students leave engineering, get a degree and go be successful, like a lot of people could care less if they get engineering degrees because they're not necessarily prioritizing what the enterprise of engineering cares about. And they're being much more nuanced in how they think about the priorities and interests of the community you're talking about and the interests of the field that they're in, because it can get complicated and those are not always in alignment with each other. So that looks like, so now we have acknowledged the fact that the problem context is there. We've acknowledged the fact that research comes from other places and practitioner needs to be there. Now you have these arrows that I've added is basically, you have to also acknowledge the fact that there are people who are practitioners and researchers who move up and down the cycle. So if you haven't thought about it before, the innovation cycle to research or practice really illustrates the flow of information. So when you're talking about like questions and ideas and answers and insights, that is assuming that the most important thing moving is the information and the knowledge. Whereas once you start talking to people, you start realizing that the bodies themselves are also moving from the position of being a researcher to a practitioner. So we think you have to basically complicate that a little more so that it's clear that when it comes to something like dissemination or collaboration, it's not as straightforward as I will get these answers, I will publish them and people will use it, because some people are moving back and forth in ways that, like the current ways in which we talk about research or practice and dissemination and things like that, don't account for the reality of the people actually on the ground trying to do a lot of this work. And then the fourth and final insight is that the measures we use to monitor progress influence the cycle in ways that should make sense, but we don't always account for. So as we talked about in the beginning, people can pick and choose what they want to use to measure progress. And there's a lot of them. It can be quantitative, so you can anchor on numbers, or you could do more qualitative things, or you can look at it in a completely different way. But basically, if someone asks you if we're making progress, whether you're intentional about it or not, you are drawing on something and using that to make decisions. And there's a lot of different ways that people do this. So one way is people use global measures. So according to some research by London, so this is one of the ways that Jeremy London classifies impact. So she talks about societal impact of thinking about things that are more at like the level of like the country. So if you're talking to some people, they will decide whether we're making progress or not based on the extent to which they see progress like across the country. So if racism is still a big issue in the country, it's going to show up in engineering, and some people will start leveraging kind of the ways in which they're viewing things at a very high level. So they might make global claims like, well, racism is not going, or racist people are still teaching these classes. Like they might make statements that are not quantified and that you couldn't really measure, but they're a lot more subjective and have to do with experience or like the way they view things at a high level. At the contextual level, people use 3 different types of measures. So one is we have a tendency to leverage these cohort measures. So people will look at a specific class that either entered or left and start looking at numbers like, okay, well, in 2010, this many people graduated, this looks like progress, or they might say, well, the retention rate for this group, and they'll think about things at the level of either universities or a collection of universities. People will also talk about individual programs. So if somebody leads a mentoring program or an after-school program or runs a charter school, like they might judge progress based on the extent to which the thing they're in charge of is making progress. So some people will say we're making progress because they've personally seen progress, like they've done something that they consider to make progress. And then lastly, people also use these student measures, which could be things that are more affective. So people will go off the quality of the experiences students are having, conversations they have with students. They might lean on individual success stories that come to mind, a lot of different things, but it gets a lot more personal. And as you can imagine, depending on who you're talking to, what you're talking about, what kind of point you make, when you're bouncing around between considering the programs we're implementing, how students are experiencing it, the numbers we're seeing at cohort level, global measures, like we're not all aiming at the same thing, and it gets real complicated real quick when you're trying to get everyone on the same page as it relates to what we're trying to even do, like what numbers are we even working towards, how are we conceptualizing the problem, how are we thinking about progress, but also too, how do we know that we're making any progress in the first place? And if we can't get on the same page there, it can create some complications. And then lastly, as you can imagine, people often rely on control groups and comparison groups. So everyone does not do this, but some people will judge whether or not we're making progress, for example, based on what the numbers look like for a different group. Oftentimes you see people center whiteness here, where they'll say, well, if the numbers look like this for Black students and it looks like this for white students, then if there's a discrepancy, then we're obviously not making progress. Or you might see them say, well, the students who participated in X look this way, and the students who participated in Y look this other way. Clearly the people who are participating in this are doing better, so we are making progress as a field as we're trying to solve the problem. And you'll see them do this in a lot of ways. People compare cohort measures, program measures, and student measures, and they use control groups in very different ways, and it really kind of depends on what it is they're trying to do. Some people will leverage certain measures as a way to motivate them to get up and keep doing the work. So as you can imagine, if you've been doing this for 20 years, you need something to tell you that what you're doing matters. So like some people will draw on different metrics for something like that. Whereas if you're trying to justify the fact that we need to keep focus on this, you might leverage different measures. So we're still trying to disentangle what it means and when we should use which measures and kind of what they show and what they hide. But we have noticed that most of the times when people are talking, if they are talking about progress, what they're using to make that distinction can fall in one of these 4 categories. So here's a question that I will stop to answer, and it says, do we think as a field that we should try to align measures of progress or better appreciate the diverse measures for what they are trying, or what they are, or something else? So I don't think getting everyone to use one measure makes sense, because as you can imagine, as soon as you say this is the measure, the people who are in charge of stuff will find ways to game the system and make that one measure move without actually solving the problem. So what I think is more important to do is for the people who are using these measures and consuming these measures to have a better understanding of what the measure is actually telling them and what it is not telling them. Because realistically, in order for us to get a good understanding of how we're making progress on something so complex, we have to have a combination of metrics that we're very competent, and we have to make sure that people are not abusing them for their personal gain. Like it's to just kind of to deflect our attention. Because if you aren't, a lot of people are very strategic as it relates to which numbers they show you when. So I think as a community, I think we have to have conversations about which ones we should be using when and who should be using them. So that's another point is I don't think every stakeholder is going to rely on the same measure. So like if you're a dean of the College of Engineering, I would assume that you're using different measures of progress than somebody who's teaching in a first year engineering class. And I think that there has to be space for us to all rely on different measures, but I think we do need to have a conversation that brings all the evidence to the table so that we can make sure we're not oversimplifying or overlooking some parts of the problem as we move forward. So then if we come back to this updated version, what that looks like is there are these impact measures. So if you're a researcher, you have probably come up with a research question based entirely on a report like ASW by the numbers. So it is not uncommon for someone to look at data and say, oh, let me go explore this thing. Whether practice thinks that needs to be answered or not, as researchers, a lot of times we will find national reports or big data sets and just say, okay, well, this clearly shows that something's happening, let me move forward. On the same end, practitioners also get answers and insights from the data. So people also use those data to make sense of whether they need to create new practices, where they need to shift their answers. And I think right now, the way we talk about research and practice doesn't account for the fact that the measures we're using as a community to talk about the problem also influence the way all of this works and need to be represented in a way that is not anchored on research or assessment, but does account for the fact that we need to start asking some questions about the impact measures also. So this is a tentative version of what this might look like. I made this in PowerPoint, so this still looks very cyclical and very linear because this is what I was able to do in PowerPoint. But this represents kind of what I think the relationship looks like. And I think it can kind of provide a little more nuance as we're thinking about what our role is as researchers, or what our relationship looks like as a person in this field trying to solve this problem, or someone who's trying to do research and practice work in another context where the problem space needs to be accounted for. There's assessment that needs to be accounted for. People don't necessarily stay in these boxes and just pass information around. Research from other field actually said some insights that you need to account for while you're doing this work. And there are these impact measures that are influencing what we're doing. So there's one more takeaway. So if you missed everything I said, I want to make one more point. And that point is that broad anticipation is a complex public issue. So I'm using that term very specifically because I think it's at the root of some of the things we're doing wrong as it relates to trying to solve this problem. And this insight came from a book called The Sociological Imagination. So it is a very old book by C. Wright Mills, and it's considered like one of the more foundational books in sociology, where it talks about the awareness of the relationship between personal experience and wider society, which is basically what he's put forth as the sociological imagination. So in this book, they make the distinction between what a trouble is and what an issue is. So for troubles, these are things that occur within the character of the individual and within the range of his immediate relation to others. Whereas issues have to do with matters that transcend these local environments of the individual and the range of his inner life. So when I say it's a public issue, I am saying that broad participation transcends the local environment of individuals and their personal life. Whereas I think a lot of times we treat it as if it's a personal trouble and start looking for solutions that are within the range of someone's immediate kind of circumstance. If that does not make sense, the book offers a very clear example as it relates to unemployment. So if talking about race and engineering does not make it real clear to you, I'm going to take a step back and talk about something that might be easier for you to digest. So unemployment is something that happens all around us. So in these terms, consider unemployment. When in a city of 100,000, only one man is unemployed, that is his personal trouble. And for its relief, we properly look to the character of the man, his skills, and his immediate opportunities. But when in a nation of 50 million employees, 15 million men are unemployed, that is an issue, and we may not hope to find a solution within the range of opportunities open to any one individual. The very structure of opportunity has collapsed. Both the correct statement of the problem and range of possible solutions require us to consider the economic and political institutions of the society and not merely the personal situation and character of scatters of individuals. And if you take nothing else, this is how we have to think about broad participation. If we are not considering the fact that there's a structure, the structure of opportunity has fundamentally collapsed, which is one of the reasons you have to account for the US engineering and the structure of education in relation to the disparities and systemic racism, you're going to try to solve problems that are not actually the reason that we're seeing this issue. And if I take you back to the initial one, I would argue that the definition that is largely used by NSF is focused on troubles. We're talking about the interest of individuals, the preparation of individuals, the connection of individuals, the experiences of individuals, and the opportunities of people among these certain groups. And I think framing it this way basically encourages people to try to solve problems that are not actually problems. So you see a lot of research thinking about how do I get people more interested? How do I help students gain more networks? And they're really trying to solve what I would argue is personal troubles when the problem is actually a public issue. So a definition that was reframed would look more like, how do we address inequitable resource allocation, interpersonal racism, negative perceptions, and chilly climates along work environments? So it's a subtle difference, but as you can imagine, if you were a researcher and this was a call, or if you're a practitioner and someone was saying, this is what you're supposed to do, what you see as pathways moving forward is going to be very different based on the way you conceptualize the problem. So as we move forward, as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. So we're still thinking through what all this means, what it looks like, whether or not the metaphor of a cycle even makes sense, because that doesn't necessarily accurately represent the contributions and interrelations of research and practice as it relates to solving this problem. So as we move forward, we are continuously trying to solve this right now. And next, there are two recent conversations that I actually want to connect this to. So one is, I watched the seminar that you had last time, and when they were talking about the taxonomy driving inclusion efforts, there are two parts they make that I hope that this reframing of the relationship explicitly addresses. So one is, a lack of knowledge is not a big factor. So when you talk to people, it's not that we don't know what we should do. So when people talk about the role of research, it's not that they're saying like, we don't know what to do, we need stuff. It's much more like, I need research to prove to people in power that what I'm talking about is actually justified. Or I need research to help me be a little more strategic here and there. Or they might need to work with researchers to think about securing funding. It's not, so like, if you do think that the reason we're not broad participation is because the people trying to solve the problem just need more information about the problem or need to understand how it works, like that is not the reality. Which relates to the second one is, if you think the researcher's job is to simply give the people trying to solve the problem the answers and insights and suddenly they're going to solve the problem, that also does not reflect the reality between the positioning of researchers and practitioners. So you do have to think about, completely reconceptualize where you see the role of research as it relates to people trying to solve this problem. There is a role for research and researchers, but it's not necessarily the role of, I'm going to find information, I'm going to give you the insights, and then suddenly the work you're going to be doing is better. And the second one is a very recent guest editorial in JE that called for a disentanglement of engineering education research from anti-Blackness. And I'm hoping that as a part of moving forward with this research paradigm that Dr. James Holly Jr. called for, is that if we rethink the relationship between research and practitioners and start being more intentional about where we position people and how we're thinking about it and situating it within the context of this problem of anti-Blackness and racism, that we can move forward and kind of address the call that he has recently put forth to the community. And that is all I have. So we have time for questions, and I'm real curious what feedback or questions y'all have.
So I'm not sure how the Q&A piece will go, but I know there were some questions early on in the chat about the Delphi study. You didn't touch much on that yet because I think it's part of your future work, but could you maybe tell us a little bit about what a Delphi study is and how it fits into the next steps of your work?
Yep. So for the Delphi study, so this part of the project is being led by Dr. Jeremy London. So if I misspeak, it's because I'm not leading that part currently. But right now, the basic idea is you're leveraging the fact that experts being able to share information and respond to them is a good way at getting consensus. But it's acknowledging the fact that, say, for example, if Robin, Cindy, and I were in a room together and we were having a conversation, the fact that we are all people will influence the way we react to who it is. So instead of me just taking Cindy's argument for what it is, I'm going to say, well, Cindy said it. Cindy knows more than me. It might bias the ways in which I critique or engage in Cindy's ideas. So with the Delphi study, we basically have a group of subject matter experts who have agreed to participate in a round of activities that are moving towards us developing a research agenda. So we've completed the first phase. So for the first phase, we developed a list of recommendations from the interviews with subject matter experts and the articles. So looking at what people said we need to do. And we created a list of things that represent all the stuff that people say are things we need to do moving forward. So for the first phase, we sent it to the practitioners and said, do you understand these recommendations? And do you consider them relevant? And we did that to kind of get everybody on the same page. Moving forward, we will then ask people the extent to which, like, how would you prioritize these? Like, if as a field, we're going to try to solve this problem, which one of these things do you think is most important to do and why? And then by that point, you should be able to get a good understanding of how people are ranking stuff and also why. And then you can send those results to other people. And then you can give them the opportunity to revisit their ranking based on now the new insights that other people have provided. And then you keep doing that until you reach a certain level of consensus. And the idea is it's a more objective way to get at building consensus, where you have experts, but you're not necessarily putting them in a space where the fact that they know each other and they can see each other is going to influence what they're moving forward. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. So like how many phases you have, what level of consensus you're trying to get, who you consider experts, like there's a lot of things you can do, but that's like the general idea, and that's how we're using it. So there was a question about, is it that the structure of opportunity has collapsed? That seems to center whiteness. If you decenter whiteness, it seems that the structure of opportunity has always been obstructed by Black people, for Black people. I agree with that. Like, I think it is, I definitely think that that is a very good point, that I think because the original book was talking about class, it's probably, that language probably makes more sense. Where if you are talking about a system where the anti-Blackness was not unintentional, it's not like we accidentally ended up here. It probably is more like the structure of opportunity has been destroyed. And the researchers are really trying to rebuild something that was very intentionally destroyed. And there's also people trying to keep it from being rebuilt, which I think is back to the point of why I consider it uphill battle. I think often we talk about this problem as if there are no people trying to keep the problem. And I think when you think about it being a battle, I think it acknowledges the fact that there is opposition that has to be accounted for as you're doing this work also.
There's a question in the chat. I'll look at the chat.
Here's a couple one. So I got a message about talking about how I see the framing of troubles and issues working in tandem, or is it shouldn't be prioritized over the other? I think if you are talking to individuals, and I think this is where it gets real tricky as a community, because I think there are some people who are focused on the lived experiences of the people they encounter on a day-to-day basis. And there are other people who are talking about much more systemic issues that require a much longer vision and a much more significant reimagination or revolution as it relates to the systems. So I think that there are some people who are fundamentally thinking about it at a high level, rightfully so, and I think we need people doing that work. But I think that at the same time, there are people who have Black students showing up in their office tomorrow who might be showing up with things that look like troubles, and they might have to figure out how to focus on those at the same time. So I think it's a very hard tension, because sometimes the fact that we are thinking about troubles of students that we see on a day-to-day basis can take away the fact that we're actually trying to solve these larger problems, or we're going to keep dealing with these problems over and over because they're not actually going away. So someone says, what do we do when there are 2 Black students in engineering class of 40 and the rest are whites? And I think that relates to dealing with the personal, like, it depends, like, are you going to focus on the experience of those 2 Black students, or are you going to take a step back and call for the system to be changed in such a way? And I think it depends on where you're personally positioning yourself in the battle as it sees fit. So like, if there are students in your class, and I think you do have to make that experience as positive as possible, but I think as researchers, we would be doing a disservice to the people trying to fight the battle if we were only focusing on what they were doing today, as opposed to trying to prevent them from having to keep doing that in 10, 20, 30 more years. There was a question I got about, do I think the goal of BPE will ever be achieved? I honestly don't know what the goal is. So my answer would be, unless we, I think, and this actually brings me back to, so I gave this talk in a very similar format last week. And one of the things that, one of the points that came up was like, should we call it broadening participation? Should it really be focused on anti-racism, and kind of like where we see that tension? And I think we're at the point where broadening participation has become a social phenomenon. And that's one of the things, like, as Brent Jessic talked to me, that was one of the things that I realized, is that there is this thing that we call broadening participation. And whether that is the thing we should be doing or not is a different conversation. But like, the fact that we have a group of people and we've created this enterprise of people whose goal is to get more people in these spaces and to improve their experiences, like, I think that is a reality. So do I think that we will ever get to the point that that is achieved? I think that will be very hard to achieve until the larger issues in the United States are solved. So if you go back to the 4 underlying issues that I've talked about, I don't think there is anything engineering could do to account for the fact that there's still systemic racism. The United States still has disparities as it relates to resources. Our education system is structured in such a way that resources go to where people live. And the public, well, that last one we probably could. We could have a campaign, like we could reimagine engineering. We could think about getting engineering in the media. We could think about interest in stuff and that part probably. But I think the other 3, because they're slightly beyond our scope, I think the whole country is going to have to move forward before we see some of the progress that we're trying to get from in engineering. And that's one of the places I go back and forth of is I think sometimes we're trying to solve problems that, like, to be completely honest, an engineering education degree does not prepare you to solve. And I think we have to be real strategic about, like, where should we put our effort versus where do we actually need to rely on the expertise of people who are trained either in organizing and activism because they're actually doing the work out in the communities, or people who are scholars in like some of the more pure social scientists who can help us understand these problems in a much more intentional and sophisticated way. Because like we are one part of a larger fight. And I think we have to realize like we're not the only people doing the work. We can't reinvent the work, and we have to be really intentional about where we position ourselves based on where we are in the system and what we know how to do. Are there other questions? I'm not sure I understand the last question.
Hello.
Hello.
Am I being heard here?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, hi. Thanks. So I guess my point was like Nagash had brought up like the issue of like creating.
You
No,
muted
you're not
yourself.
being heard.
You went back on mute.
Oh, sorry. Hello. I think Nagash had brought up the point about like, you know, we worry about getting people to campus, but what happens once they get here? What about the environment? And that being said, I think in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion issues, we spend a lot of time talking about like implicit bias and how to deal with that. But I don't think we've really fixed the problem yet that we still have explicit bias everywhere. Like I think sometimes we're trying to think that we've moved past and we need to like blatant racism and we need to worry about more subtle issues, which is true. We do have to worry about more subtle issues, but we haven't solved the, you know, explicit and blatant racism problem yet, as is very clear by like national movements, for example. Like what can we do in EER about the more explicit issues?
I actually think this is one of the places where even if the world around us didn't change, if engineering wanted to, it could make changes. So like we control the structure, the policies, and like the responses to unwanted behavior. So like while you can't stop someone racist from showing up at the door, but you can decide what the punishment is for behavior that is racist. And I think the field, this is another tangent that I know we're being recorded, but this is what my response is. I think there are certain parts about the engineering education system that could solve problems, but we're not willing to change. And like, I don't know how you would get the people in charge to be honest enough about the fact that they're not willing to change this thing, even if that's what it would take to solve the problem. For example, a lot of people would talk about the fact that when you have a tenure system where it's real hard to get rid of bad actors regardless of what they do, to your point, like what can you do even if someone is doing something that is very clearly race motivated or racist? But on the flip side, like if you asked engineering deans if they were willing to change the promotion and tenure process in the name of getting rid of anti-Black racism in engineering, the answer would probably be no. So like I do think there are, if you think about even emissions, are people willing to adjust their emissions to remove some of the bias or preferences that they're giving for people from certain cultural backgrounds? The answer would probably also be no. I don't think anyone would go on the record and say that, but I think that, to your point, some of the more explicit intentional decisions are often either couched in a different priority. Like it's real easy to argue for why the fence needs to stay up. even if a lot of people could argue for another reason why the fence needs to stay down, but I think people that are in charge are smart enough to not make their explicit bias so known that you could actually point at it and call it racist. And I think people are just more comfortable talking about implicit bias. That is not informed by my interviews. That was me as a Black researcher talking to you. Just answer in response to your question.
Thank you.
How do I feel about the fact that people are racist or anti-racist? That is a much longer conversation. I do not fully agree with that framing. And I think it oversimplifies a lot of stuff, but it would take me way long. Like I would get way off topic. And that is a much longer conversation that I would probably not want recorded. Yeah, but I do not have a smart, concise, short, and politically correct answer to that question, given how much time I have left.
Why don't we pause it now and transfer from the more official Q&A to a more social time. So I'm going to promote everyone who is in attendance